Welcome to class, everyone. Grab a seat. I'm so glad you're here for today's explainer. Today we are going to examine the fascinating, incredibly complex, and often turbulent history of a nation that was born in trauma and has been swinging on a historical pendulum ever since. I'm your host, and for today's session, your history professor, and we are looking at Pakistan from its inception in 1947 all the way up to 2026. The core thesis we are going to explore today is how Pakistan's 80-year history is defined by a striking, almost inescapable cyclical pattern, a continuous pendulum swing between civilian political instability and direct military involvement. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our syllabus for today's explainer. We're going to trace the swings of this historical pendulum through 6 distinct eras, starting with the nation's birth, moving through its military and democratic cycles, and ending up with modern crises. Let's jump right into Act 1, Birth and Early Instability, spanning from 1947 to 1958. So, born from a really bloody partition in 1947, Pakistan emerged as this geographical curiosity. It was literally divided by 1,600 kilometers of Indian territory. Millions of people were displaced in a massive migration, cementing a deep, deep national trauma right out of the gate. And just 13 months into this new reality, the country suffers another massive blow with the tragic early loss of its founding father, Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Now, this early volatility really amplified the foundational friction of the new state. And this brilliantly illustrates the core issue. Look at this balance of power. On one side, West Pakistan held all the political, military, and economic hearts. But on the other side, East Pakistan, they actually had the majority of the population, but they found themselves systematically marginalized from the civil service and national resources. This intense geographic and political imbalance was, quite literally, a ticking time bomb. Following Jinnah's death in 1948, the nation's very first prime minister, Liaquat Ali Khan, was assassinated in 1951. Talk about a massive institutional vacuum. Between 1951 and 1958, an absolutely astonishing 7 prime ministers came and went. 7. The civilian politicians were basically locked in constant infighting, totally unable to govern effectively. And, as you'll see, this specific chaos set the perfect stage for the military's very first major intervention. Which brings us perfectly to Section 2, the first military era from 1958 to 1969. By the late 1950s, that pendulum takes its first massive swing away from civilian rule. Army Chief General Ayub Khan steps in, ousts the president, and declares martial law. And he governed with the genuine belief that politicians were simply incapable of solving the country's problems. So he institutes this system called basic democracies. Now, while it certainly sounded empowering, in practice it was really just a mechanism for highly controlled, top-down governance. Under Ayub Khan, Pakistan actually saw significant infrastructure growth. We're talking dams, highways, massive industrial plants. But here is the catch. The wealth was grotesquely unequal. It was concentrated in the hands of just a few industrial families, which further widened that already massive gap between East and West Pakistan. Which leads us to this incredibly heavy historical number, 93,000. In December 1971, following a terrible, bloody civil war and intervention by India, 93,000 Pakistani soldiers surrendered to the Indian military. Just to put that into perspective for a second, it was the largest military capitulation since the Second World War. So how did we get there? It was the culmination of the 1970 elections. The Bengali-led Awami League actually won a clear majority, but the Western establishment outright refused to accept it. That led to a brutal military crackdown known as Operation Searchlight, and ultimately East Pakistan broke away to become Bengal. Think about what that means. Pakistan lost more than half its population overnight and its most fertile territory. This monumental loss generated this profound existential anxiety about national survival, a trauma that deeply, deeply cemented the military's central role in the state moving forward. Let's move into Section 3, the democratic military pendulum. This is the intense interplay between civilians and generals over the next 3 decades. Now, what's really interesting about this is how powerfully simple words can rebuild a nation's political landscape. Emerging from the wreckage of 1971, a highly charismatic politician named Zulfikar Ali Bhutto used this electrifying socialist slogan, bread, cloth, and shelter, to build a massive base of support. He managed to restore a sense of civilian supremacy, give Pakistan its most durable constitution in 1973, and even launched the Covert nuclear weapons program. But, as we know, the pendulum swings. His authoritarian tendencies led to major unrest, and eventually the military, led by General Zia-ul-Haq, seized power and actually hanged Bhutto in 1979.
General Zia-ul-Haq fundamentally transformed Pakistan, primarily by introducing strict Islamic laws. But his rule also collided with the massive Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Almost overnight, Pakistan became the indispensable frontline state for the U.S. and Saudi-backed Afghan resistance. And the social consequences were profound. We're talking 3 million Afghan refugees settling in Pakistan, billions of dollars in CIA and Saudi-funded weapons flowing across the border. We see an explosion of heroin production and the proliferation of sectarian organizations. It literally created what Pakistanis themselves called the Kalashnikov culture, leaving the state with deeply entrenched jihadist networks and a saturated weapons market long after the Soviets withdrew.
After Zia's mysterious death in a plane crash, the pendulum swung right back to civilians, initiating the democratic decade of the 1990s. But it was highly dysfunctional. Power alternated 4 times between Benazir Bhutto, who, by the way, was the Muslim world's first female prime minister, and Nawaz Sharif. Yet, get this, neither leader completed a full term. They were constantly dismissed by presidents, pushed out by military pressure, or ousted through judicial complicity, usually amid swirling accusations of corruption.
Moving along to Section 4, Musharraf and the War, spanning from 1999 to 2008.
Following the Kargil conflict with India, General Pervez Musharraf seized power in Pakistan's 4th military coup. And after 9/11, he fundamentally altered the geopolitical landscape by allying with the U.S. in the war on terror. But let's move to and see how this builds to his downfall, because this era eventually unraveled in a rapid sequence of compounding crises. First, his sacking of the Chief Justice triggered massive civil society protests led by lawyers. Then, a deadly military assault on the militant-held Lal Masjid in Islamabad provoked severe retaliatory attacks across the country. In a total panic, Musharraf declared a state of emergency and suspended the constitution. But the absolute breaking point was the tragic assassination of Benazir Bhutto in December 2007. It plunged the entire nation into grief and rage and ultimately forced Musharraf to resign and hand power back to civilians.
This brings us to Section 5, Modern Crises and Contested Politics, covering 2008 to 2026.
From 2008 to 2018, something truly historic happened. For the very first time, 2 successive civilian governments actually completed their full terms. However, civil-military tension remained the absolute defining feature of the state. A major hallmark of this modern era was initiated under Nawaz Sharif's 3rd government, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC. We have to look at both sides of this. On one side, you had the promise of a massive $62 billion investment in infrastructure, framed as an absolute economic game-changer. On the flip side, very serious criticisms and anxieties emerged regarding severe debt burdens, highly unfavorable profit repatriation terms, and the strategic implications of such deep Chinese penetration into Pakistan's economy. Now, despite completing parliamentary terms, individual prime ministers continued to face early ousters in a repeating pattern. In 2017, Nawaz Sharif was disqualified by the Supreme Court amid the Panama Papers leaks and undeclared income. Then, former cricket star Imran Khan, who came to power in 2018 on this massive anti-corruption platform, became the first prime minister removed via a parliamentary vote of no confidence in 2022. Khan's removal, which happened amidst severe economic crises and well-documented disagreements with the military establishment, sparked massive, unprecedented public protests and plunged the country right back into fierce political warfare. And as if the political turmoil wasn't enough, nature delivered a totally devastating blow. $30 billion. That is the estimated damage from the apocalyptic monsoon floods in the summer of 2022. To put that into perspective, a third of the country was completely submerged and 33 million people were displaced. It was a climate catastrophe on steroids that compounded an already desperate economic collapse, pushing Pakistan to the very edge of sovereign default. Furthermore, the security environment remained incredibly fragile. A militant attack in April 2025 led to an unprecedented military escalation between India and Pakistan, involving airstrikes, missiles, and drones. It took intensive global diplomacy to finally secure a ceasefire. This terrifying episode laid bare the enduring danger of the unresolved Kashmir dispute. It's a potent reminder to us that the region remains a highly volatile flashpoint for 2 nuclear-armed neighbors.
Finally, we conclude our lecture today with Section 6, the Great Unfinished Question. So the crucial point is this. As we look at Pakistan by mid-2026, despite modest signs of economic stabilization, like inflation dropping from its peak and slight GDP growth, the foundational issues haven't changed. the nation is still plagued by an inadequate tax base, chronic energy shortfalls, feudal land structures, and above all, the persistent civil-military imbalance and the totally unresolved question of civilian supremacy. These are the exact same structural issues that have haunted Pakistan since its traumatic birth way back in 1947.
Pakistan is a country of extraordinary contrasts. It's resilient, vibrant, full of incredible potential, yet heavily weighed down by its history. I want to dismiss the class today by leaving you with this final provocative thought. Can the democratic impulse ultimately prevail over the authoritarian one? Has the historical pendulum finally stopped, or is it destined to keep swinging? Thank you so much for joining me for today's explainer, and I encourage you to keep questioning the history that shapes our present. Class dismissed.